You never truly understand the fragility of life until something minor spins everything into chaos. What was intended as a simple family trip to the mountains, a chance to reconnect, turned into a tangled experience the moment Thomas insisted on going. His obsession with appearances sought to portray us as the quintessential perfect family, oblivious to the reality that our marriage had devolved into a mere business partnership. Ethan, Thomas's son from his first marriage, always seemed distant, never fully accepting me as his stepmother. I agreed to the trip more out of habit than genuine desire, my role well rehearsed: comply, maintain the peace, and avoid conflict. Yet that weekend held a different surprise in store. It began with a seemingly innocuous mistake, a mix-up with the lodge reservations. Thomas had inadvertently booked the wrong dates, leaving us one room short. With a casual wave, he suggested I share a room with Ethan for just one night. That night, as I lay in the dim light beside Ethan, the fragility of our family dynamic became painfully clear. Looking back, I couldn't help but wonder if everything was destined to unravel or if it was that one night at the lodge that set it all in motion. The consequences of that weekend would ripple much further than I could have ever anticipated. The drive to the lodge was long and quiet, the kind of silence that emerges when there's little left to say. Thomas's grip on the wheel was steady, his focus on the road ahead, while I stared out the window, lost in thought. Ethan in the back seat had his headphones in, eyes glued to his phone. This was familiar territory. Our family outings had always felt like three separate individuals moving in parallel, never truly connecting. "Bring the hiking boots!" Thomas broke the silence, his voice steady. "Yes," I replied flatly, his attention already diverted back to the road. Ethan barely spoke, a pattern that had become all too common, especially around me. At 2008, he carried a quiet intensity that often felt elusive, as if he was perpetually guarding some hidden truth. He resembled his mother with her dark hair and sharp features, constant reminders of a past that lingered between us. I harbored no resentment toward him. His mother's death had left an unfillable void in both Thomas's and Ethan's lives, yet a chasm remained between Ethan and me that neither had actively sought to bridge. Upon our arrival at the lodge, the sunset bathed the mountains in a warm golden hue. The lodge itself was quaint and rustic, echoing memories of past family vacations while simultaneously starkly highlighting the distance we had yet to overcome. Thomas checked us in while Ethan and I unloaded our bags from the car. Ethan took one room for himself, and Thomas and I shared the other. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but I remained silent about it. The room we shared was small yet cozy, featuring a queen-sized bed that looked inviting in the warm light of the lamp. Arriving at the lodge in the evening, the mountains bathed in a beautiful golden glow. The lodge had a rustic charm that reminded me of our family vacations, cute but unpretentious. As we approached, Ethan carried a suitcase across the gravel, glancing back at me. "This place is nice," he remarked, catching me off guard with his conversation. "Yeah," I replied, surprised he was engaging me at all. He turned his focus back to unloading the car. Inside, the lodge exuded warmth and comfort with its wooden panels and inviting furniture. But when Thomas returned from the front desk, his expression suggested something was amiss. "There's been a mix-up," he said, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "We only have 2 rooms available tonight. The third won't be ready until tomorrow." I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. "So, what now?" "We'll figure it out," Thomas said briskly. "I'll take one room, and you and Ethan can share the other." I didn't argue, though I wanted to. Thomas seemed to shrug off the inconvenience, moving forward without hesitation. Our shared room was small but cozy, with a queen-sized bed complemented by a warm lamp casting a gentle glow over the soft quilt. The scent of pine drifted in through the open window, filling the space with a tranquil aroma. "This is cozy," Ethan said neutrally as he set down his bag. I forced a smile, trying to play down the awkwardness. "It's just for one night." He fiddled with his phone, and I tackled the unpacking, putting away my belongings in the small bathroom. The tension hung palpably in the air, thick and unyielding. "You take the bed," Ethan said, gazing out the window. "I can sleep on the floor." "Don't be ridiculous," I countered, shaking my head. "The bed's big enough for both of us." After a moment of hesitation, he nodded. I lay on one side, staring at the ceiling, while Ethan settled beside me, his breath soft in the dim light. I tried to convince myself that sharing the bed was perfectly fine, but deep down, my instincts warned me otherwise. That night, everything began to feel different. The room settled into a quiet calm, with the sound of crickets echoing outside. Shadows danced on the walls as the soft light from the lamp created a surreal ambiance. Dinner had been a customary quiet affair. Thomas talked about work while sharing stories, and Ethan and I nodded along, but it felt like we weren't truly present. I couldn't pinpoint when the tension had started. Perhaps it had always been there, an underlying current I had chosen to ignore. Now, it was impossible to dismiss. "You're not really reading, are you?" Ethan suddenly broke the silence, drawing me from my thoughts. "What makes you say that?" I replied, somewhat defensively. As Thomas's tales faded into the background, I realized we were all trapped in our own worlds, desperately clinging to the pretense of normalcy amidst the unspoken tension that filled the room. I can't pinpoint when the tension began. Perhaps it has always lurked beneath the surface, like a current I chose to ignore. Now, it's impossible to overlook. "You're not really reading that, are you?" Ethan broke the silence, his voice laced with curiosity. Feigning nonchalance, I chuckled as he smirked and set his phone down. "You've been on the same page for 20 minutes, he teased. I laughed softly, feeling a twinge of embarrassment. "You caught me," I admitted. He shifted in his seat and suddenly, something in his body language seemed more relaxed than usual. "What's on your mind?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond but hesitated. "Nothing," I replied, perhaps too quickly. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not convinced. "Come on, Margaret, I know." The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine. It was different from the usual stepmom, evoking an intimacy I hadn't expected. I sighed and leaned back against the headboard. "I guess I'm just reflecting on how things used to be. Family trips used to be fun, right?" Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, they were. Back when it was just me and Dad before I realized how fake everything was." His words struck deeply. "You're better than that," I said gently. I had tried, quietly, to be someone he and his dad could rely on. "I know," he replied softly, his appreciation evident in his gaze. "Even if I don't always say it." For the first time, it felt like the walls between us were beginning to crumble. We talked for hours, sharing frustrations about Thomas and reminiscing about the trips he had taken with his mother. She had been the glue that held Ethan's family together. "It's hard," I confessed, "to measure up to someone like that." "You don't have to," he said simply, a weight lifting from my shoulders. We fell into a comfortable silence, and as I turned off the lamp, the moonlight spilled into the room. My leg brushed against his and I murmured, "Sorry." Pulling back instinctively, "It's fine," he said, his tone low and soothing. Yet, the moment felt charged. Each small movement seemed amplified, a reminder of our proximity. "Are you okay, Ethan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, breaking the fragile silence. He hesitated, his brow furrowed. "I'm fine," I lied. "I don't think you are," he said, his voice taking on a softer quality. Before I could respond, he shifted closer, the warmth of his body enveloping me, and I froze. "Ethan, I need to ask you something," I whispered. "Do you ever feel like you're pretending?" The question hung in the air and he nodded slowly. "Sometimes. It's like I'm living a life that isn't really mine. I do everything I'm supposed to, but it never feels real." His words resonated within me, tapping into an unacknowledged truth. Each day, I grappled with the sensation that something was amiss, though I could never quite grasp what it was. Then it happened. It was not dramatic or planned. In an instant, our conversation shifted from hushed tones to intimate silence. His hand brushed against mine, and neither of us drew away. Then, one day, it happened. It wasn't a grand drama, but rather a subtle moment that shifted everything. We were conversing in hushed tones when his hand brushed mine, and neither of us pulled away. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. I should have said no. I should have left the room. But instead, I turned toward him, my heart racing. "Yes," I whispered back. When it was over, silence enveloped us. My mind spun with confusion and guilt, rendering me unable to speak. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he finally murmured, breaking the stillness. "Don't apologize," I replied quickly, my voice shaking. "It's fine, I don't know what this means." "Neither do I," he admitted, and in that moment, I knew deep down what it truly meant. The next morning, I rose before Ethan, slipping out of bed quietly. The soft dawn light filtered through the curtains, casting a warm golden hue across the room. I dressed quickly, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. By the time Ethan stirred, I was seated by the window, feigning concentration on the view outside. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words, but after a moment, nodded and retreated to the bathroom without another word. At breakfast, the tension between Ethan and me was palpable as we joined Thomas in the dining room. Oblivious to the undercurrents, Thomas sipped his coffee and read the newspaper, commenting on the weather and our plans for the day. But I could feel Ethan's gaze on me, heavy, searching, and it took all my willpower not to meet his eyes. I hoped the tension would ease, that the memory of the previous night would fade, and we might return to a semblance of normalcy. Yet, as the day dragged on, I began to understand that some moments, once forged, could never be smoothed out. The drive back from the lodge was quiet, but it felt oppressive, filled with unspoken words pressing in on us. Thomas remained blissfully unaware, humming lightly as he navigated the winding mountain roads. Ethan sat in the back seat, gazing out the window, while I focused ahead, my hands tightly folded in my lap. I tried to absorb the scenery, the rolling hills, dense forests, the golden light filtering through the trees, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the night before. Every detail was etched in my mind, the sound of Ethan's breathing, the fleeting brush of his hand against mine. It felt surreal, like a dream, yet the consequences lingered heavily in the air. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He appeared calm, almost indifferent, but the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers gripped the armrest betrayed his unease. We were both avoiding what lay between us, the reality of our shared moment that would forever alter our lives. We both avoided each other's gaze, unsure if that was a relief or a punishment. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Thomas stretched, already planning the day ahead. "I've got a meeting in a couple of hours," he announced, "but we should do something tonight, maybe dinner at that new Ian place?" I nodded, though the thought of a family dinner made my stomach churn. Ethan said nothing. He grabbed his bag from the trunk and walked silently into the house. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of chores. I folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, and reorganized the bookshelf in the living room. Despite my efforts to stay busy and distracted, my thoughts continually drifted back to Ethan. I replayed our last conversation, particularly how he expressed feeling lost and struggling to be someone he wasn't. The quiet understanding in his voice lingered, the kind I hadn't felt from anyone in years, certainly not from Thomas. The sound of footsteps on the stairs jolted me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his jeans. "Hey," he said, his tone awkward. "Hey," I replied, surprised at the strain in my own voice. We looked at each other, the silence stretching, until he cleared his throat and glanced toward the kitchen. "I was just going to grab something to eat," I said, stepping aside to let him pass. As he brushed past me, the brief contact left me breathless. I resumed tidying up the counter while he rummaged through the fridge, trying to ignore how my heart raced with every move he made. "Last night," he began, his voice tentative. I froze, gripping the dish towel tightly. "We don't have to talk about it," I interjected quickly. "Yes, we do," he insisted, closing the fridge and turning to face me. I could tell he was nervous, his hesitation palpable. "We can't just pretend it didn't happen," he stated firmly. "Why not?" I challenged. "I'm saying that's exactly what we must do. Pretend it didn't happen and move on." He stared at me, confusion etched on his face. "Is that what you really want?" "What I want doesn't matter," I replied, trembling. "Whatever this is, it can't happen again." "Why not?" he demanded, stepping closer. "Because it's wrong, because it's inconvenient, or because you're scared?" "Stop it," I snapped, turning away from him. His voice softened. "You don't have to keep pretending, Margaret. Not with me, please." "Ethan," I whispered, feeling tears well up. I was so anxious, unsure of what to do or say. I didn't want him to feel like I was hiding from him. He sighed and took a step back, running his hand through his hair. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone sincere. "I didn't mean to make this harder for you. It's already hard." I nodded, my voice barely a whisper in agreement. He held my gaze for a moment longer before turning and leaving the room, the tension still hanging heavily in the air. That evening, Thomas was in his usual lively mood, chattering about work and future plans. Ethan and I feigned interest, nodding and smiling at all the right moments, but the atmosphere crackled with tension. At one point, Thomas looked over at Ethan, his expression. Feeling uneasy, I decided to pace the living room. It had been a few days since things had felt this way, and I was starting to get worried. I couldn't maintain the facade that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Deep in thought, I didn't hear Ethan come down the stairs until he spoke. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and measured. I turned to see him standing there, the faint light illuminating his worried expression. Here is the polished text. Future Ethan and I both played along, nodding and smiling at the right moments, but the tension was unbearable. Thomas turned to Ethan and asked, "You've been quiet today. Everything okay?" Ethan forced a smile and replied, "Yeah, I'm just tired from the trip." Thomas nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and continued eating, but I could feel Ethan's gaze on me, heavy and searching. Later that day, Ethan was quiet again. I approached him and asked, "Hey, everything okay?" He smiled quickly and replied, "Yeah, I'm just tired from the trip." Thomas nodded in agreement, but I could feel Ethan's gaze on me, and it was heavy and searching. After Thomas went to bed, I found myself pacing the living room, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't shake. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I didn't hear Ethan come down the stairs until he spoke softly, "Can't sleep?" I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression cautious. "No," I admitted, barely above a whisper. He stepped into the room, his hands shoved into his pockets, and we stood in silence for a long moment, the tension growing with each passing second. Finally, I spoke up, "I don't know what to do." He looked at me with a mix of emotion in his eyes. "I don't know what to do either," he said quietly. His gaze dropped to the floor, and his voice cracked as he said, "I don't want to lose you." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Ethan, we can't," he said quickly, his voice pained. "But I know I don't want to lose you," he repeated, his words barely above a whisper. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "This isn't fair to any of us. He's probably sulking somewhere. He'll be back when he gets hungry." Thomas dismissed, his tone fanning the flames of my anger. "This isn't sulking. Thomas, he's clearly upset." I felt my frustration surge as he shot back. "What do you expect me to do about it? He's an adult. If he wants to act like a child, that's his problem." My disbelief was palpable as I stared at him. "You really don't care, do you?" I challenged. "Of course I do," he replied, though the indifference in his voice betrayed him. "But I'm not going to chase after him. He needs to grow up and deal with his own problems." Turning away, I struggled to steady my breath. The weight of the situation pressed down on me like a heavy shroud. The subsequent days were agonizing. My mind raced with worry about Ethan. Was he safe? Would he come back? Every moment was consumed by the gnawing anxiety of not knowing where he was. I tried calling, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Thoughts of driving around in search of him flickered in my mind, yet I couldn't fathom where to begin. Thomas continued with his life as if nothing had changed, leaving me alone to shoulder my concerns. One evening, as I sat in the living room, my phone on my lap, I received a call from my friend, Sophia. "I haven't heard from you in a while," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Is everything okay?" I paused, taken aback by her question. "It's complicated," I finally admitted, the truth heavy on my tongue. "Complicated?" she echoed, her curiosity piqued. "Ethan left," I finally replied, the words feeling like lead in my mouth. "He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back." Her tone shifted sharply. "Did something happen?" I hesitated, the weight of my unspoken worries swirling within me. "It's just been tense lately," I managed, sidestepping the full truth. "Aha," Sophia said, her skepticism evident. "Well, if you need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." "Thanks," I replied quietly, yet my heart wasn't in it. After the call ended, I sat in silence, staring at the empty space where Ethan once filled the air with laughter and conversation. The house felt larger, emptier without him, and I found myself trapped in a cycle of replaying our last conversation. His gaze lingered in my memory, the raw vulnerability etched in his eyes. He had asked a question that haunted me. Was it just a mistake to you? I still lacked an answer, torn between doubt and truth. Perhaps it was merely a mistake, or maybe something deeper, a truth I was not ready to confront. What I did know was that I missed him, and that realization terrified me more than anything else. Weeks wore on, and the void Ethan left became increasingly unbearable. Thomas buried himself in work, moving through life as if oblivious to the turmoil surrounding us. Any mention of Ethan was brushed off with a wave, leaving me grappling with my unease. I worried incessantly, sensing something was deeply wrong, yet unable to pinpoint it. As the silence in our home tightened its grip, I found myself driving around aimlessly, hoping for a glimpse of Ethan. I relentlessly checked his social media, but found nothing, only emptiness that mirrored my own. "He'll be fine," Thomas repeated, his voice steady as he assured me. "He always is!" But I wasn't fine, and I couldn't tell if Ethan was either. Some afternoons I found myself aimlessly driving around, hoping, praying for a glimpse of him, walking down the street or sitting in a cafe. I compulsively checked his social media, but there was nothing, as if he had vanished completely. A nagging guilt settled in, his departure felt like my fault. The note he left was short, almost too casual, and the timing couldn't have been a coincidence. What had I done to him? That haunting question pressed down on me, its weight heavy with every unoccupied moment. It was a Thursday evening when I found the note. Thomas had left for a dinner meeting, and I was alone in the house, wandering aimlessly from room to room until I ended up in Ethan's room. The familiar scent of his cologne lingered in the air as I sat on the edge of his bed, absently tracing the seams of the quilt while trying to imagine where he might be. I noticed his desk, cluttered with a stack of papers hastily piled in one corner. Curiosity pulled at me. I hadn't meant to snoop, but I picked up the stack and started rifling through it. That's when I found the letter addressed to me, though it wasn't signed. "Dear Margaret, I don't know how to say this, so I'm writing it instead. I hope you never read this, but if you do, I hope it helps you understand. I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about that night. I know it was wrong, and it probably meant nothing to you, but to me. It meant everything." Each line struck deeper, resonating within me. I felt seen and valued in a way I hadn't in a long time. Ethan's words tangled with my heart. He lamented how hard it had been for him to navigate his feelings. I don't know what to do with that. I've tried to let it go, but I can't. I think that's why I have to leave. I never meant to make things harder for you. Take care of yourself, Margaret. Always, Ethan. I read the letter 3 times in disbelief, the weight of his words suffocating. My hands trembled as I set it down, overwhelmed by the chaos in my mind. He had left because of me, because of how I had responded, or rather, how I hadn't. I should have felt relieved that he was gone. His absence meant an end to temptation and risk, yet an ache hollowed me out, a deep emptiness threatening to swallow me whole. Later that night, Thomas returned, his tie loosened, the distinct smell of whiskey clinging to him. He dropped his briefcase by the door and headed straight to the kitchen, pouring himself another drink without a word. I followed him, clutching the letter, the turmoil inside me bubbling to the surface. "Thomas!" I began, my voice trembling. He turned to look at me, concern flickering in his eyes. But there was no comfort in his gaze. Only the echo of Ethan's words lingered in my mind, heavy and unresolved. He dropped his briefcase by the door and headed straight to the kitchen, pouring himself another drink without a word. I followed him, clutching the letter tightly in my hand. "Thomas!" I began, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his tired eyes filled with an edge of impatience. "What is it, Margaret? I need to talk to you." I tightened my grip on the letter, feeling an unexpected surge of determination. "No, it can't wait!" He frowned, crossing his arms over his chest. "Fine, what's so important?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat, heavy with the weight of what I needed to say. Instead of speaking, I handed him the letter. "What's this?" he asked, taking it from me. "Just read it," I whispered. He unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to anger, then to something darker. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "It's from Ethan," I whispered, my heart racing. "No kidding," he snapped, holding the letter up as if it were a weapon. "What the hell does he want?" "Thomas, what did you do?" he shouted, anger radiating from him like heat from a fire. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I replied, tears threatening to spill down my cheeks. "It was a mistake," he repeated, his tone laced with venom. I felt his anger closing in on me, suffocating in its intensity. I struggled to respond, my voice faltering. The weight of his fury was too much to bear. In a fit of frustration, Thomas stormed out, slamming the door behind him with a force that echoed through the house. I sank to the kitchen floor, staring blankly at the crumpled letter in my hands. For hours I sat there, torn between the urge to scream, cry, and run away from it all, but my body felt frozen, unable to move. The next morning I forced myself to rise, the quiet of the house pressing down on me like a heavy shroud. The absence of both Thomas and Ethan made the space feel unbearable, as if I were trapped in a nightmare with no escape.